Hi, good evening, everyone. I think we're now live streaming. It looks as though we are. So, welcome. So, this is a hybrid audit committee where we've got some members in person and some attending virtually, and we've also got a number of officers attending virtually. Just as housekeeping, would members mind raising their virtual hand, and we'll come to you, but do bear with us. I think we can more or less jump into it, and I just actually wanted to start by just giving a warm welcome to Althea. I think we can very much appreciate Althea in her capacity as attending tonight's discussion. And with that in mind, I was actually going to ask and suggest to members that we might reorganise the agenda ever so slightly, so that we could do some of the discussion on item 8, internal audit progress report, and bring sort of that up to the first substantive item, and then just out of courtesy to Alfie, we might be able to sort of have that discussion earlier on. If that's okay. And if members would agree with that change, I think that might just help us manage our time. I think I can see agreement there. I think we can jump straight into it just in terms of the usual items first. Can I ask the clerk, are there any apologies?
Yes, there's apologies for absence from Councillor Anthony McCormack, who's on other council business.
Thank you. I think that looks to be it.
That's okay.
Are there any declarations of interest from members? And I think there is a rule that it is just those required in person that
yes,
to do it.
From people in the room.
Yeah, brilliant. Are there any comments on the minutes from the last meeting?
Oh, sorry, Chair, the minutes aren't ready. They're going to be pulled.
Oh yes,
too soon to
yeah, that's quite right. My apologies. So we'll have the minutes in the September meeting. That takes us to the actions log. I think we really had this as we went through it last time. So I was going to propose that we skip over this again, unless anyone's got any comments. Okay, so this does take us to agenda item 8, given that members kindly agreed to sort of switch around so that we could accommodate Althea. And I think I'm inviting Nicola perhaps to give a few words of sort of overview, and then we might be able to pick up the discussion of sort of one source following on from sort of our last committee, which is one of the reasons that Althea has kindly agreed to attend tonight. But Nicola, I don't know if you wanted to say a few opening words.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, I'll hand over to Nicole Mativia, who's the Internal Audit Manager, to present this report, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. So this is our quarterly progress report. It includes a review of the work that we've undertaken since the last meeting. It also includes a summary of the implementation of the recommendations. It includes a draft internal audit plan for Q2, and also a rolling 9-month plan for consideration as well. We've also reported back on a number of pieces of work which I'm willing to take questions on. Otherwise, I'll hand over to the chair for questions.
Brilliant. I think we'll sort of take it as read, and as I sort of suggested, might we start with some questions around one source. We wrote a letter as a committee to the Chief Exec, and we asked that an audit be undertaken to look at some of the governance arrangements with that. I don't know if any of the members would like to come in first with any questions of that, or otherwise I'd be happy to pick up one or two. Okay, if I perhaps make a start. I think the sort of thrust of our sort of previous discussion on one source, and Simon's very kindly, as one of the accountable execs, has joined us in person. I think where we got to was effectively wanting to make sure that the previous internal audit recommendations have been implemented, tracked, monitored with the sort of due speed and care that we all wanted to see. And I think sort of my question for yourself, perhaps initially with Alfie and then Simon, is is how are you managing and putting a sort of program management wrapper around sort of the existing internal audit recommendations so that we can sort of crack through them with the sort of urgency that we all recognise. I don't know who would like to come in first on that thought.
Yeah.
Oh yes, Althea, sorry, if we could take her off mute, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members. Very grateful for you moving your agenda around to accommodate my item first. And I think the first thing to say is to thank you as well for raising this and the work that you've highlighted in this area. I'm very appreciative of that, and especially given my position as the Chief Executive, it's always helpful to have more of a kind of rounded view of all of our areas of operation, and this has really helped to highlight some of the areas that we can improve, I think, in the way that we oversee our services as provided by OneSource, as indeed by all of the council, and so this is a good opportunity to have the discussion. I think it's probably helpful, and Chair, you'll have received my response, so it's perhaps helpful for me to just be clear about our organisational arrangements for overseeing OneSource. And I know that I captured some of this in the response to you, but I think for other members it might be helpful, and then to allow Simon and indeed Conrad to speak some more. So as you've said, Simon is the Executive Director. He is responsible for OneSource, and he's accountable for the delivery of the services provided through the partnership of OneSource to the council. And it is a partnership arrangement, as despite its name, it's not an outsourced arrangement. Conrad Hall, as our Corporate Director for Resources, is responsible for ensuring that the appropriate client arrangements are in place in regards to that OneSource agreement. And then in terms of the relationship with me, I do hold regular one-to-ones with Simon, but he also has those with the Chief Executive of Havering, so that although he sits as part of the corporate management team, his responsibilities do sit across both of the councils, and we have our respective relationships for managing that. And one of the things that's been, come out of the audit report, the work done by BDO, is how we weave in the responsibilities and the oversight of the delivery of those recommendations to our corporate management team reporting. We have a monthly performance CMT meeting. We meet weekly, but one of those every month is dedicated to overseeing performance. And just yesterday, in fact, because we meet every Tuesday, we talked some more about how it will be helpful for us to be much clearer about how we are, as part of that CMT arrangement, overseeing the delivery of audit recommendations, and indeed any recommendations that are applicable to OneSource, and that oversight of that OneSource arrangement. So to answer your question, that's something that we've picked up as an action from the report, and we'll be building that in so that we've got that complete oversight of those recommendations, rather than looking at them in a sort of almost in their silos for each service. I think to save on time, I'll stop there for a moment and let Conrad or Simon come in, perhaps Simon first, and then happy to continue to feed in and answer questions as we go on throughout the item. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Arthur. I'm trying to project through the mask. It's me. So just to let you know, we've taken not only the BDO report very seriously, also the letter that the Audit Committee wrote very seriously. Been through all the reports and from the audit that were mentioned in the letter. I think there were 9 of them. And there is a common theme, I think, through all the reports, and that's one around there being insufficient controls coming out of OneSource for some of the processes we manage. Certainly those processes have been picked up by the Audit Committee. Just to reassure the committee, we take each and every action of every audit very seriously, and we do welcome the external assessment. We try and learn from it. But there's no doubt in my mind that some of the areas that we have been looking after have slipped as our energy was drawn to the pandemic last year. We have, since the Audit Committee on the 22nd of March, built much closer links now with Audit. We've improved our internal governance as per the BDO report and some of the ideas we had as well. And that's allowing us to better manage and communicate our improvement journey, certainly around internal controls. There are some updates on some of the reports mentioned in the Audit Committee's letter in this meeting, so I won't dwell on the details of those now. But I'm joined by Patrick Montgomery, who's Director of IT up there, virtually Ben Plant, who's HR Director, and Rose Younger, who's Procurement Director, so we can answer any specific details if you want. It's fairly clear, though, that we need to work together with LBN and the Audit Committee to strengthen our internal controls. We're fully committed to that. In answer to your question earlier, Chair, we have got a programme of work. There is other work that we're doing as well that come up in other reports. We did an exercise taking every action point from for example, the Audit Committee, but also from other work we've done. And then we mapped it against our existing strategy to see if we needed to change strategy. Everything mapped quite well, which we were quite surprised about. So what we've done now is put all the action points into a programme of work, allocated officers to them. We monitor their progress against them every month. And that's also monitored by the Section 151 officers of both Havering and Newham, and also the Joint Committee. So we have an ongoing programme now, probably a 2-year, quite intensive piece of work, I would say.
Thank you. Before we turn to further questions, I didn't know if Conrad, you wanted to build on any of what Simon's just said.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies, having planned to attend the meeting in person, I now can't. So very little to add to what's just been said there. I think the only two things to add. So there's an existing arrangement that monthly my counterpart Jane West at Havering and I meet with OneSource, and Simon is the Executive Director of OneSource and some of the senior OneSource officers, and this is always one of the agenda items there. That meeting is particularly helpful, I think, in identifying issues that may exist in one or other borough, but not necessarily in both, in order to identify whether there are things that we can build on as a result of that. The other thing to say, fairly self-evidently, I think, but just to emphasise it, clearly what the BDO report does is give you a fair degree of assurance that the arrangements are in place to ensure self-improvement, which is the kind of key point in all these arrangements, really. No organisation gets everything right, but what matters is the capacity and capability to identify what's gone wrong and to put it right. It doesn't paint a perfect picture, of course it doesn't, but that moderate level of assurance, particularly after the year that we've been through, I think the committee can place a reasonable degree of reliance and assurance on that, that means that these issues that have rightly been identified are being tracked and will be tackled. So I think much of that has largely been said, but it was worth emphasising those particular points. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any members want to come in at this stage? Is it on OneSource issues or the wider report?
It's the report, agenda item 8.
If it's on OneSource, we can perhaps cover it now. If not, would you just perhaps?
It has a link with what?
Okay, yeah, please.
But first, let me ask, on page 61, there is no 2.9. Is there meant to be a 2.9?
That's an error of numbering by myself. Sorry, apologies.
Okay, then. Yeah, well, therefore, my question, Chair, is referring to 2.12 bullet point 3.
Mind if we come to that in one moment, because that's on the Internal Controls Commission report. That's okay.
If you prefer to do that way.
Is that all right? Just to close off this section on OneSource, if we may. I don't know if there's any questions. Yes, Mike, and then Neil on OneSource.
Hi. If you wouldn't mind just following through my thought process on this as I kind of come through, digest what you said. I think it should be noted that a moderate assurance report, whilst not the substantial assurance we'd want to see is actually a good sign, given that the reason we wrote the letter was repeated limited assurance related to some of the services delivered by OneSource. Actually, I think that is we should always recognise positives, and that is a positive step forward. It was interesting, you talking about partnership rather than outsourcing, and hearing how both Newham and Havering are trying to work together. And I'm trying to understand really who really drives the improvement of the OneSource service. Is it driven by OneSource? Is it driven by a particular council? And how do you balance the demands of both councils in that single service, particularly as there are, you know, different organisations with different priorities? I guess that's probably a question for me.
Well, that is the great trick in shared services, I have to say. We have governance mechanisms that help, and so the regular meeting that Jane and Conrad and I attend is very useful. So we're trying to focus that on not only, you know, what have the two organisations noticed they want change, but also what strategic changes they're making, and also can act as a facilitator to try and fix problems together. There's also the joint committee, so that's chaired by the mayor. Sorry, not chaired by the mayor, and two members of the cabinet on both sides. That's again an area a meeting we can thrash out differences if need be. But actually, the power of the shared service is that there are two sets of idea generators, I guess, and two sets of eyes on us. So you know, if one organisation spots something we're not doing well, we can fix it before the other one notices it. And equally, if a good idea comes from ones, we can compare them. Sometimes strategies are different, sometimes policies are different, and we deal with that. It's our job to sit in the middle and make it work. So it has its challenges, but on the whole, I think shared services is a very good model, providing it's done as a partnership.
And do you think that partnership model is understood through the council? Do you think on the ground staff see it as a partnership, not an outsourced service? I think if I was honest, it varies. I think the facts, having worked in the field in shared services before, I'd say the brand OneSource doesn't help. It gives the impression that it's an outsourcer. I think other shared services around the country without a brand probably find it a little bit easier, but they have the same challenges. We try and create a culture in OneSource that sits in the middle, if that makes sense, so that we are kind of separate in a way because we have to deal with slightly different issues. But we're very careful to make sure that people understand when they have meetings with us that we work for them. So it's a hard trick to put off. And I would say, no, I don't think every single member of each council understands that it's part of their council. I guess back to perhaps the Conrad is, from a council perspective, what more can we do to get staff to recognise it's a kind of a service that's part of the council, and they can drive and be supportive of that improvement of service and feeding back and driving improvement? Because ultimately what we don't want to see is if we describe this as a partnership and it's treated as a separate service, and it's almost a slight blame culture you can see developing over time to it's outsourced problem, OneSource's problem, not that's the version said. Yes. OneSource's problem, not the council's problem. Yeah.
Shall I respond to that one, Chair? I mean, I agree and recognise those points that are made, and we are working, in many ways, I think, to move away from a legacy where OneSource, although legally it has always been a partnership, legally it has never been a outsourced contractual arrangement. My impression, and as you know, I've only been at Newham 2 years, but my impression is that a few years ago, the arrangements probably were treated rather differently. So, to give you a few for instances in how we tackle that, at meetings such as the senior leadership team, senior leadership forum, OneSource executives there are present in the same way and not differentiated from council colleagues, and we keep that sort of joint working process going right through the organisation. There are some historical charging arrangements that we're sort of unwinding, which partly just because they were sort of moving money around the organisation rather than really adding value, but they kind of reinforce this impression that staff had, and not entirely without reason, that what OneSource was doing was providing a service that was charged for, as opposed to just working within a partnership. Essentially those are just internal recharging mechanisms, So by unwinding those, that also helps to drive the point that actually this is just our vehicle for providing sport services, and happens to be delivered under the One Source banner, but is not to be viewed as an entirely separate organisation. I think Simon is right to say that, in a sense, having it separately branded is not entirely helpful in that respect, but I do think the kind of collaborative working culture that all of us on the management team and throughout the organisation are developing is breaking that down.
Just to build on some of that, in terms of having accountability for embedding the improvements we all want to see, of course the nature where you have some employees as falling under Havering headcount and some falling under new headcount, and I believe, Simon, do you report to the chief exec of Havering, for example? So just how do those, the fact that you've got employees on two different headcounts, different line management, how can we have assurance that there's accountability, particularly in terms of driving forward the improvement, given that employees sit on different headcounts?
I understand the point. I think the reality of it is Althea is as much my boss as the chief executive of Havering is, and Conrad is just. I would say that I probably have more bosses than most, as opposed to less. So the accountability is very acute. I'm political bosses, and I think people in shared services realise that. We sit there, and so we've got to do our best all the time because there are so many eyes on us. So I honestly don't think accountability is an issue in shared services. I think it's probably heightened to some extent.
And Neil.
Yeah, when this had its gestation in 3 boroughs, it was crossing over a lot of service areas, and some of us had concerns. One of the issues for me is that if I go to the council website, we've got everything from asset management, legal and governance, finance, HR, information systems, procurement, and that other one, the PPPs, performance policy programs. My concern has always been that there's about an internal coherence to that model, which is both accountable but not separate to the council. Are we getting better at that?
Councillor, I haven't experienced it before. I joined under the current corporate management team. Sorry, I joined under the current corporate management team, so I don't have anything to compare. But it feels very much like part of the council. The accountability flows from you. I don't know if that answers your question.
One of the systemic things that I think we always task with really in audit is that we may have the right level CMT and DMT, etc. But what about the culture, which is about the cross flow of not just information, but how Mike and you, I think, Chair, have also alluded to, corporate identity, but about the communication flow, because one of the things was about clear communications on objectives, performance expectations, monitoring, delivery. I'm saying that these are, on the face of it, quite disparate service areas, but with the one identity that is reporting in a different way. Does that make sense where I'm going with that?
I think to interpret that one way, I think what you're saying is we've got some assurance from today that those meetings are happening at the sort of CMT level, but your thought is lower down the corporate hierarchy. What are those sort of relations like with One Source? And to draw that out as a perhaps question, that might be more around what's going on in terms of communicating One Source's role and structures across the council.
I think Althea has a response on that.
Yeah, thank you, Althea.
It was directed to you, Althea, really. You guessed where I was going with it, possibly.
Thank you, Councillor. To some extent, I was putting my hand up to respond to the previous question, but I'll try and weave the two in. I think so that driving improvements. I just think it's really important that firstly that understanding. When Simon sits alongside his CMT colleagues at that CMT meeting in those forums, he is held equally to account as his colleagues are. So there is no, there is not a separation, there's not a different relationship. So not only are those improvements being driven through my relationship with Simon or through the arrangements we've already spoken about, they're being driven by Simon actually answering to his peers at those meetings and in those discussions who are seeking improvements in those areas in order for them to deliver more effective services. So I think there are a number of areas in ways in which that happens. Apart from, as Simon's already spoken about, we have very robust discussions. I have very robust discussion with Simon about my expectations and my expectations for Newham, because the point was made, we are two different councils. We have similar agendas in some ways, and we have very different agendas in other ways. And we have, we're incredibly ambitious, all the things that and I am absolutely clear about the fact that Simon, as that executive director for that service, albeit a partnership, holds the key to many of the doors that need to be unlocked for us to deliver on our agenda. And so the conversations we have around that are very robust and very challenging, as they would be and as they are with any of my other corporate directors. The other point on that improvement, and I think this begins to speak to your point, Councillor Wilson, about those, lower down the organisation, albeit Simon is very much recognised as that executive director, the organisation has a relationship with those other directors too. So where there is an HR issue that requires resolving, or there is something that needs to be dealt with, it's not as if the part of the council that requires that will say, right, Simon, I'm bringing this HR issue to you, can you deploy, can you sort that out within your structure? We will go to Ben Plant, and Ben Plant will come to have those meetings and conversations directly. If it's a procurement discussion, the same happens with Rose Younger. If it's an IT discussion, the same happens with Patrick Montgomery. So those individuals, as those directors within the service with those respective responsibilities, are very much seen as part of the solution to the issues that we are seeking to resolve and the improvements we're trying to drive. And I think that is, I wasn't around before, 2 years ago, but I believe that is very much a culture that's emerging now. Again, stepping back to the question of everyone's some perceptions of ownership that can emerge when you are dealing with any slightly removed partnership. So prior to becoming the chief executive, I was a strategic director for resources, and even then, as a strategic director reporting to the chief executive with no other complications in the relationship, it wasn't unusual, if it wasn't kept in check, for other directorates and corporate directors to start to say, well, it's resources that are getting in the way of this, or the IT isn't supporting this. So that is something I think you always have to be mindful of and protect against, where you're dealing with central corporate services, and that challenge becomes greater when you have an arrangement that's slightly more complex, like the one that is the one source one. But I think that cultural change, I've spoken to the audit committee about this before, is something we're working through at all levels across the council. And yes, there are some peculiarities that need extra attention because of the one source arrangement, but it's something that we have to address across the council in its entirety. I hope that answers at least some of your question, Councillor.
If I just come back.
Yes.
Just on the timescale, we've got moderate. When are we having the? Well, it says a copy of the full report's available on request.
It might be that actually, as you mentioned it, Neil, that the report is circulated to members, and that we have
a discussion on.
We have some sort of check to see how those recommendations. I think there's 2 recommendations coming out of it, and we sort of have sight of their progress because it's a catch-all across a variety of services. So I think if you receive the report and track the progress, that gets us there. But I was actually at this point going to sort of start fanning out to some of the sort of services within it, because under this item is reference of some of the other limited insurance reports that were in the letter around mobile phones, IT, JML and so on. So at that point, open it up to members for that sort of next part of the discussion on this.
I'm going my question.
Shall I start then? Just just to kick us off on some of the other areas in this report, if that's all right, on JML, because I believe we had a copy of the work that you've been doing, Ben, and would be keen to understand some of the timelines around that. And I thought that was principally focused around levers, but the other aspect we're looking at was around the JM part of the equation too.
Yes, so we commissioned an end-to-end review of the joiners, movers, levers processes, and the committee have seen the executive summary from the levers element of that work, which was of particular interest. We're now planning the implementation of all of that, and it is on the agenda for the OneSource management team meeting on Monday next week. So there's a series of quick wins to address, as you would expect, the most sort of pressing concerns identified in the review, and then a sort of medium-term program around really optimising the end-to-end process.
I think we probably welcome just more tangible dates around some of those, so that we can see that journey. I know that you mentioned the sort of quick wins, and I think you put some dates around those, just to be able to put something against that journey would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. I could advise the committee in writing after this meeting.
I think that'd be great. Thank you. And then we've sort of got other themes in here around mobile phones and so on. Did you want to come in on any of the other items?
If I can just raise the point on IT, Patrick. So I guess I'm kind of putting pieces of the report that we've seen previously together. So I know someone came back on the written note I put in that 66% of recommendations not implemented. IT is the top risk to the council. According to the risk register, it's the #1 risk on the new corporate risk register. So should we still be concerned about the controls and the assurance within the IT function within the council's remit? I'm not going to say within OneSource, it's council as well, within the council's remit, because it's both top risk after mediation, that's how I read the risk register, after all the list of stuff has been applied, it's still the top risk of the council is IT, and 66% of recommendations made through a limited assurance report have not been implemented.
Good evening, everyone. So I think it's a really good point. I mean, to address the audit points first, there's unfortunately a little bit of a lag in that the report that you've got in front of you with that 66% dates from May. So actually, we've made a lot of progress in the last 2 months on the audit points, and we now have so in the two to go separate them, the IT assets and the mobile phones. In the IT assets, there were 27 recommendations, of which 13 we have now completed, 13 are partially completed, 4 of which will be completed this month, and the remaining should be completed by the end of August. So we are in a better place than it appears. And similarly for the mobiles, there were 7 recommendations, of which 3 are fully completed, and the remaining 4 again should be completed by the end of August, some sooner than that. So the situation, there certainly were some challenges, and I'm relatively new as well. I joined 4 months ago, and I think a lot of it stems to quite a shift in working patterns from last year, as we suddenly had to move to remote working and maybe didn't have as many controls as we should have about allocating IT kit to staff, but it was quite unusual circumstances, and the team have been working very hard in the last few months to try and address all the points. So I think we are in a much better place, and I can sort of go through or summarize, if you would like, the various sort of audit points. And as for the risks, I think we should. I think we have a separate part of this meeting on that, but I do think it's probably right to have some IT risks quite high up at the moment, because we are so dependent on the technology with people working remotely at the moment, and also with the heightened risk of a cybersecurity attack. So that doesn't mean to say we're not doing a lot of stuff in the background to mitigate that risk, but it just is quite a big dependency at the moment, more than, you know, in a usual working environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on mobile phones as well, and just in true hybrid meeting mode. Are you speaking with Ben and working to join that sort of gap that existed with the levers and the mobile phone assets, and what was the timeline around that? Because that was sort of, I think that was the sort of key aspect of that report, wasn't it, in terms of physical track?
I mean, absolutely. The sort of levers process and sort of getting assets back is very crucial, not just for mobile phones, but also for other IT assets like, you know, laptops, etc. I mean, on the mobiles, the risk has gone down quite significantly because we've moved to a new contract where the sort of monthly rate is very low. So the sort of financial exposure to the council of someone leaving and not handing their device back, we can capture that quite quickly and disconnect it. But certainly for things like laptops, when people leave, we want to get them back, and we don't want the manager to keep it in their cupboard, you know, waiting for another staff. So we're trying to have better processes, and we've got better monitoring now. And I will say it's not perfect yet, because there's some devices that were handed out last year during the sort of panic to get people equipment during COVID that we didn't log at the time. So if they haven't been on the network, well, once something appears on the network, even if we didn't log it before, we can register it. But there are some devices that have probably disappeared in people's cupboards that aren't on the network that we can't track. So we're sort of planning a bit of an amnesty for those. And one of the other audit considerations for that was the security of the data on those devices. But that is in the Windows 10 build much more secure because the devices are encrypted, so there is less risk of data leakage.
We have the statistics shared around on the sort of number that you think are out there that sort of, as you say, were sort of haven't been connected to the network that you're trying to retrieve. Could we just have that headline number?
The ones that we know of, yes, I don't have it to hand, but I can certainly try and find it for you, if not today, as a follow-up action.
I guess those are the knowns, aren't they? What about, how are you working out the unknown, whatever the room's felt?
Yeah, the unknown. Yeah, exactly. The unknowns. Yeah. Yeah, that is more difficult, and we're going to have to sort of just ask people to sort of hand them in for those aspects where they have, and do a bit of a sort of laptop amnesty.
We have just a bit of a scaler around that, and just a little bit more offline about what controls you're putting in around that, understanding the context of the pandemic, but just to have some assurance about the retrieval of those assets and the controls you've got will be helpful offline.
Yeah, and just to be clear, for current devices, new devices, we have them tracked. They are registered in our asset database. They are registered in SCCM, so we know when they've last logged on, last been used. So that, you know, those ones are fully under control. Our gap is more with the ones last year that were handed out and haven't been on the network, which is a relatively small amount, but there are some that I have to. Yeah, we're still working on how to find those. But that is compared to the 26 recommendations that were in the IT asset report. That's a relatively small piece. A lot of the other items were around our sort of stock control and verification, that we now have very robust processes in place. The order process, we've updated our policies, and probably there's a longer term piece where we want to try and rationalize policies, because there's quite a lot of IT policies, but in the short term, we have now got policies that are being either completed or being completed, covering assets and acceptable usage and all the other sort of elements that were flagged in the audit.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Arvinder's hand came up in a minute. It's come up twice.
Oh, thank you. I struggle to see them. I think Arvinder has.
Chair, thank you. Just a quick question. Sorry, I'm off screen at the moment. A quick question with the numbers, really. You mentioned the laptops or the phones. Do we sort of have a quantity or the 1, 10, 15? I know it's, as you said, there's going to be an amnesty where we're going to try to call them in.
Yeah.
But as a figure, do we know? Because obviously there must have been a purchase when we made a purchase, and obviously if we've got purchase 50 and we've got count of 25, we know 25 are missing then, isn't it?
Yeah, we definitely should have that. And for the mobiles also, we know, every connection, we have a bill, a monthly bill for that, so we can link it. So for the mobiles, it's less of an issue, or it's not really an issue. But for the laptops, yeah, we know, well, the difficulty is there was a lot of handing out that happened in a somewhat uncontrolled way last year. Like some people might have received a PC, had a problem with it, and then the project team that was handing them out gave them a second PC, and we've probably registered one of those PCs, but not the other one. So we now need to just go back and make sure that if people have kept one just as a spare, that they hand it back, because it's more efficient for that to be handed out to other council staff, and to save the council having to buy additional devices.
Thank you, Aravinda. I think, as I say, we might do a bit of offline follow-up on that one.
Yeah.
Mike.
I've got just a question on ICC for Althea and Conrad, if that's okay. I guess my opening question is, do you believe that the findings and recommendations of the ICC report are being embedded within the council? And where do you see the risks to that process going? Are there any particular areas, departments, that maybe you need to now focus on more to continue the embedding of that change?
Chair, would you like me to take that one, Althea, and then perhaps you come in, or would you like to say something first, Althea?
I'm happy for you to go first, Conrad. Thank you.
So I think, and we've discussed this before, haven't we? That there's two ways to look at the recommendations from the Internal Controls Commission, and the right way to look at that is exactly in the way that you've asked the question, to look at the extent to which the organisational culture is changing, so that these just become part of, integral to the kind of way that we work. It is really helpful I think, to have the sort of follow-up work that's done here that shows the sort of nuts and bolts of exact progress against each recommendation, and that's helpful and useful. But that wider cultural point has always been the more important one. And that doesn't change overnight. We never expected that it would do, but we've been working steadily at that for some time now, and you can start to see some of the difference. I don't pretend that means that every corner of the organisation is paying all of the attention to internal control in the way that it ought to be. Frankly, in no organisation do you ever quite get to that point. But certainly from the reports that I see, from the staff that I talk to, and from the way decisions that I then get involved in come forward, you can see that there is more awareness of the need for internal control and the need to be mindful of that at all times. Obviously, there are other items on the agenda. We've just been discussing one where Patrick's just outlined the progress that's been made and more to be done, and there are other items on the agenda as we'll come to in due course, where there clearly are still issues, some of which perhaps are historical, some of which are not. So I don't want to overstate the case and imply that we've cracked it, that the organisational culture is now exactly how it should be. But although it's hard to sort of quantify this, isn't it, and put a number against it, I do feel increasingly confident that the organisation is now beginning to move at some pace in the right direction. So I can give you that sort of qualitative assurance, if you like. The real test of that over the coming year and 18 months will be the sort of assurance that you continue to get from the internal audit function, if they are turning up significant numbers of new issues, as opposed to identifying how historical issues is being tackled, then we would know that we have further work to be done on that. That's one of the reasons that you have that assurance function to provide that extra level of check and comfort. But yeah, today, yes, I do feel confident that we're beginning to move and at some pace in the right direction on that.
Thank you.
Again, I guess that was a very diplomatic answer. The undiplomatic answer to my question I would prefer, which was where are the problem areas that we, whether it's not for us to wait for the audit team to find it, you two as professionals should know it. Where are still the areas of concern for you, and are you able to share those with the committee so we can kind of understand those, and perhaps that helps us shape our audit program in the future.
Just I was going to add a similar question really, which is, I noticed that 3 of them haven't got a timescale next to them. Could it be those areas, or might it be culture that are perhaps the problematic areas that are harder to crack, as Mike was sort of looking for?
I think my view would be, not to focus on, as I said throughout this, focusing on each individual recommendation of the Internal Controls Commission is the wrong way to approach it, which is not, for the avoidance of doubt, to suggest that those recommendations aren't valid. Of course they are, and we are implementing those. But it is that wider point about culture. I mean, I'm not sure that a discussion now in open forum about specific areas of the council, if by that you mean business units and services, is quite the right way to approach it. Of course, part of the audit planning process is exactly to take that kind of soft intelligence and identify areas where there might be more concerns. The risk management process is another way in which we identify where there may be parts of the council that are not operating in the way that, or not always operating in the way that we intend them to. So that feeds into the audit planning process, which of course is signed off by this committee.
I think actually I see the role of audit committees as being an open, transparent forum in which we can have those challenging conversations. So I think would welcome thoughts either here or via published material, via comments that could be captured in terms of the quarterly audit plan on precisely where those areas of the council are. So actually just to sort of gently challenge it. I think actually as a committee we do appreciate that soft intelligence to be aired about where precisely those areas of improvement are actually.
And you see that through the quarterly audit planning process. But yeah, I hear the point that's been made.
Do a follow-up?
Well, it's not follow-up, and their colleagues are going to speak to the report later, I think, on highways, but an indication of how well or how well the council has started to embed this is how perhaps some of the responses to audit happen. And so we've had a limited assurance report on highways reactive maintenance, and we were asked the question before, which we'll come on to on that point. 2 of my questions were, one was about how is that department considering and responding to the ICC report in relation to the RMS scandal. And the response I got, I'm going to paraphrase and perhaps be slightly antagonistic while paraphrasing, was it's not our responsibility, that wasn't our problem. And then I asked a question about the North Woolwich corridor investment, and just if there are poor controls in place in one part of the highways department, will that be reflective of the wider highways department, particularly the council about to embark in a massive investment, probably in one of the biggest highways investments the council's made in a number of years, multidiscipline, multi-million-pound project. And the response again was kind of, it's not my job, that's a different department. So there's that culture there of siloism and being separated, and it's not for you to respond to necessarily, Conrad, because that's unfair. It's kind of perhaps we'll pick up at the highways point. But the audit report, fair enough, is published and controlled. But we asked a quick question, and we asked them over the weekend. We've had a quick response back from officers. That response feels very much like, well, it's out. It's not really something I have to worry about. My job is just to do my job and get on with it. And so I'm going to keep asking, officers that come to this committee about ICC, and about learning from RMS and learning from the stadium scandals, because actually those are the big learnings we want to see embedded across the whole council and the whole culture of the organisation. And I don't think we can be confident yet that is happening down to the kind of granular level of delivery.
And for the avoidance of doubt, I mean, I didn't suggest that we had cracked it across the whole organisation. You know, clearly when it comes to item 7, you know, those are questions that you'll want to follow up with the officers present. I suppose, you know, the point that I was making, you know, was the audit committee is provided with that level of visibility, clarity as to the issues in various services, you know, which all then feeds into in a circle, doesn't it, through the audit planning process. So, you know, I think we're agreeing far more than we're disagreeing, and probably if we were in the same room, we would be agreeing even more, you know, about how the process works in terms of identifying where the issues might be, and indeed the information that's made available to the audit committee to enable you to fulfil that role.
Okay, well, we're going to have a separate item on procurement, we're going to have a separate item on highways. I think we can leave this item here. I actually just wanted to say to Nicole and Nicola, I thought it was a very clear and succinct report as well, so thanks very much for that. And thank you very much, ever so much to Alfie as well for joining us on that one. I don't know if you're able to stay, but I know you've got some personal commitments. Either way, thanks for your answers on that one. So thank you. Reverting sort of back to front, this now takes us back to item 5, which is the new corporate risk register. And I think I'm perhaps handing over to yourself, Nicola, on a bit of an intro to that.
That's right, thank you, Chair. So this paper is an update, 1 to the corporate risk register, which was first presented in March, and 2 to demonstrate the progress we're making on updating the directorate risk registers, and finally to give an update on the next steps. As you know, we started from scratch for the risk register in March, and I want the committee to see that we are progressing. This is living and breathing, it's changing, the risks that go on are changing, we're adding the controls. We then feed into the audit process. So for example, next quarter, we're going to start looking at the top risk, which is cyber. We've looked at some of the other risks, affordable homes, temporary accommodation. So then you can see the interplay between risk management and internal audit, providing assurance that the controls in place are operating as intended. And then the following paper, which will come onto, is risk appetite, which will then build even further onto the corporate risk register. So I'm happy to take any questions. And I've also got Adam Spires from BDO and Ben Endersby from BDO, who have just done the training and who are happy to answer any questions and who are supporting me in delivering this.
Thank you. Could I just start with a very quick one on process, which is how this CRR comes into being, because I think that you've almost adopted a top-down methodology, getting CMT in a room and so on to collate it. When will you do the flip side, the bottom-up, collating all of the directorate risk registers and cascading up through the risks on those? And have you got a prescriptive process about cascading up directorate level risks into the CRR at this stage?
So at the moment, we're working through the directorate risk registers, and you can see the ones we have done. We're working our way through inclusive economy and housing at the moment. ICT's next on the list to work through. We've done adults, children, so we're just refining those. So until we have those in a fleshed out form where we can then decide, well, which of those should then bubble up. Yeah, you're absolutely right. We started off top down. That was our starting position. We're not there yet. It will take a while. And by the end of this financial year, I expect to have had a first go at all of the directorate risk registers. So we have a pretty good idea of them. And then we can start doing the bottom up as well as the top down.
Just to follow up on those directorate risk registers, in our training session prior to this meeting, it was mentioned that there were some good examples and perhaps poorer examples of corporate risk registers. I think it would be intriguing for this committee to see some of those and to see sort of the level of planning and nuance that they get into. I think housing was mentioned as one of them, and I think given the agenda item we've got coming up on highways, I was almost suggesting that those two might be areas that we'd see examples of the corporate risk registers.
Certainly, we can bring that to the October meeting.
Thank you. Oh, I've got two hands. Thanks for pointing them out. I must get my eyes checked so I can see. Daniel has got his virtual hand up, and then Harvinder.
Chair.
And then John. I'll go to Daniel first.
Mine's quite a specific one, so if it feels a little bit too specific. On page 17 of the bundle, paragraph 3.2, a number of risks are removed. Reasoning, understandably, risk is both expected to decrease or considered to be business as usual risk managed within the directorates. And I just wanted to, in a very sort of time-specific way, query the first bullet point, which for those who don't have it in front of them, reads, the risk that due to higher than expected staff sickness, the council is unable to deliver core services. Given the change in the government's tone and the modelling that national government is being advised on around opening up and the consequences, and I suppose editing that risk slightly to be staff sickness and isolation, is that really something that should be removed?
So the decision was taken that this could be managed within the individual directorates' risk registers, because the individual directorates have different levels of ability to cover, different levels of statutory responsibility. So to have it as a corporate risk and as the attention of the whole of the CMT, it was felt that it'd be better managed within each directorate.
Could I just add to that point, and this sort of emphasises the dynamism, doesn't it, of working with risk registers? I mean, of course, what Nicola said there, is absolutely right. When these papers were dispatched, we actually had a discussion at the Gold meeting this morning on precisely the point that you raise. The data actually isn't feeding through into staff absence yet, and self-isolation is tending not to impact on individuals' ability to work. That's not true in all service areas, of course. And so, we had precisely the discussion that you're just inviting there at Gold this morning, actually. We were not minded to say, that this ought to go back onto the corporate risk registers for exactly the reason that Nicola points out. But I think it just sort of, to acknowledge the point that you've made and to emphasise the only way risk management can work is actually if you're prepared to add and subtract risks to the risk register as circumstances change. We don't think the data quite warrants yet the change in the way that you're suggesting we go, but it is, it's the second time today that I've discussed that point.
I do have in there. I'm going to John.
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. I remember when you first started with us, but one of the things you said was going to start from scratch. Looking back now to where we are today, is there a way that we can sort of say confidently that we are moving forward at a good pace? And have you found any skeletons in the woodwork so far that you think that need to be highlighted before we move further?
Thank you. I think the whole fact that we're discussing risk at the audit committee is a move forward. The fact that we discussed risk at the CMT is a move forward. The fact that Ben and Adam have people contacting them, asking them to help them is a way forward. I think we have made great strides, and in a way I think it's good that we had to start from scratch, because we have to think. It's not just a mechanical tick box exercise that happens each month. We're actually starting to think, and we're having to start to think about the controls. the fact that risks come on and off will continue over the next few quarters as we settle down on what risks the CMT do want to manage. And as the directorate risks, and again, we're having conversations with the directorates that haven't happened for, well, several years, I believe. So I think we are moving forward. And what I anticipate is that by the end of this financial year, I'm going to invite BDO to undertake another risk maturity assessment of us. If you remember, when I joined, I did my own risk maturity assessment. It came out as naive to slightly risk aware. And that would, I think, would really provide assurance to the committee where we are, and then our ambitions to move forward using something that is relevant and pragmatic to Newham and not just a paper exercise, because that's what I've really tried hard not to create something like that. You could probably go to other authorities and see arrows and loads of other different boxes, but I want something that is just talked about, and that when we come to make decisions, we do it in a risk-aware way, and that we are aware of our risks. Re-skeletons, I joined the Newham about 6 months ago, so I'm learning all the time. So I don't think anything's shocked me. I think if you look at most risk registers for other local authorities, which I have done as a learning opportunity for me, cyber will always come out as top. Recruitment and retention of staffing will always come out. Health and safety usually comes out as well. And big regeneration and project management usually comes out. So I don't think there are any skeletons, but as I don't know the unknown unknowns, as we've had that question before.
Yeah, and John, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to point to the summary of risks that have been added to the risk register. This is page 17. I was particularly concerned to see three of the bullet points, but bullet points 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I've got a comment and then a couple of questions with regard to bullet point 3 about retrofitting, and bullet point 5, delivery of the strategic development programme. To see the risks pointed out is rather concerning, because they are, of course, major policy commitments, and I would just suggest that they are high on the priorities of commitments that need to be delivered. My question is regarding bullet point 4, which again seems very concerning, the consequences of the changes toward boundaries. I would like perhaps a bit more detail on these potential risks and that may arise, if this could be fleshed out a bit of what this risk entails. And the other question I have is 3.2 over the page on page 18, and it's the bullet point which says that the risk, this of course is removed from the risk register, the risk that residents experience falls short of expectations. Now, I just wondered what reason there was to lower this risk to be lowered. Thank you.
Thank you. If I take your last question first, if that's okay. So we haven't lowered the risk of resident expectations, so that risk is still there. What we've done is we've decided that that isn't going to be managed by the CMT as a whole. It will be managed by the individual directorates, such as PPP would be a key one for that one. So the risk itself hasn't lowered. It's just not a focus for CMT, because as Conrad said, the danger is to have a corporate risk register for the CMT that just keeps growing and growing and growing. And after a period of time, you'd have 50, 60 risks on that corporate risk register, which a CMT would not be able to focus on. And the whole point is having a realistic list of risks that the CMT as a whole and as a group can all manage and focus on. So
that's clear, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then your bullet point 4, yes, At the next meeting in October, these additional risks will be added to the corporate risk register, and we'll start fleshing those out. So you will see the details behind it and what controls are in place. So that particular one is a yellow rated risk. So it's not amber or red, it's not high, but it is something that the CMT as a collective want to focus on. So we'll be fleshing that out and we'll bring that back to you in October.
And as we go through and add to it and change it, evolve it, we can make suggestions, I think, and it might be just helpful to see the trends, the directional trends. I know some of these are on as red. I know some of them will go on the reserve list, as you mentioned, Nicola, but a sense of trends as well could be a good, helpful iteration for us in understanding some of these, to build on John's point.
And then one other thing, could I just make one more point, please, Chair? Audit will start to look at the controls which are listed. So the starting point is for BDO to flesh out what the controls are. Audit will then come along and provide assurance that the controls are operating as intended, or not, if we find they're not. We can then go back to the CMT and then challenge the CMT saying, well, is that residual risk of red really still relevant, or should it be lowered? Or vice versa, is that residual risk of amber or yellow, if the controls aren't working, should they be higher? So that's where the two really interlink. And as you say, they'll change and they'll move and they'll evolve as risk matures and internal audit matures alongside it. The corporate risk register will change.
Chair, it's Conrad. Could I add one other point actually to the other points that Councillor Whitworth raises, because he's absolutely right. Dealing with climate emergency and delivering major regeneration schemes are, key policy commitments of the council. But I just want to emphasise, highlighting the risks to delivery of those is one of the ways in which you help to improve your chances of delivering on the policy. To be aware of the things that could go wrong, and hence to put in place mitigations to try and deal with that, is precisely how we try and ensure that those policies can be delivered. Now, some of those risks, of course, are necessarily very, very challenging. Who knows what future interest and inflation rate environments we might see, and that, of course, will have significant economic impact on the council and the country as a whole over the next 10 or 15 years. But by identifying those risks now, we improve our chances of managing them and help, therefore, to improve the chances of delivering on those policies. So I do think it's just important to make that point, that being explicit about the risk to the delivery of those policies in no way suggests that the council is not very, very strongly committed to delivering on those policies. It's actually a way of improving our chances of delivering on them.
Thank you for that point.
Neil? Yeah, you may think it's a bit of a fixation, but on page 23, admittedly, Nicola, they're right down the end of the list in some respects in amber and yellow. Can I just highlight number 10? We have raised this before in the previous meeting. If we've got obligations and safeguarding, I would have thought that the risk registers of both, Brighter Futures Directorates and children's and young people's and adults, there needs to be some sort of correlation or standardization about that, because we had some boundary effects that we highlighted. And then on the third party one, the risk of partnerships and critical suppliers working is inefficient due to poor contract monitoring. Well, we've got, issues about procurement coming up as well, but this one historically has not been well managed, in my opinion, about contract monitoring. And not just the procurement process, it's about how we do the review cycle and effectiveness. So I'm just flagging those up, Chairs.
Well, perhaps more broadly for each of these, we could see the controls.
Yeah. Do you agree that there's some
to see the detail that behind it?
We might need some more detail on that.
Yeah, perhaps that's for 6 through 14 as well, as when we next see it.
What we're trying to do is pick off 5 at a time to go through. Yeah. So as you can, that's why we've got 10 done so far and we haven't got the rest done. 5 done, we haven't got the rest done. To your point regarding contract management, I know in the paper that Rose Young has produced, there is a section on contract management. She recognises that, and there's, well, she's going to propose training, but she'll come on to that. So yes, it is a known risk.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, I think we can probably move on from this section because we've got almost the other side of the coin, which is risk appetite next. Did you want to say any opening thoughts, Nicola?
Yes, thank you, Jane. You're exactly right. It is the opposite side of the coin in a way. So the corporate risk register at the moment shows what we think our residual risk is. For good risk management, we need to be aware of what our risk appetite is. So what risk are we prepared to take? So for example, our risk appetite might vary depending on different aspects. So for example, health and safety, our risk appetite, the risk we're prepared to take, could be very, very low. We could have an adverse appetite for that. Other areas, such as some of our strategies, where we have to be more creative, more innovative to deliver our ambitions, we might be willing to take a bigger risk appetite. So our appetite might be higher, moderate to high. The point of risk appetite is to ensure that when we make those decisions, that we make the decisions knowing what our residual risk is and understanding what our appetite to taking risk is, and that it's not going to be the same each time. So the paper is really an approach, and I make no apologies, I've stolen best practice from different authorities and put it into something that will be pragmatic for Newham and bespoke to Newham. But it really is an approach. And the purpose is to start to have those conversations about the different pillars, about the different categories. So when it comes to decision making, we really think not only what are our exposures, but what are exposures that we're willing to take. And the next time I bring the corporate risk register back, I'd like to not only list our residual risk exposures, but also our risk appetite, so that you can see very visually whether we're within or out with our risk appetite and what we then need to do to mitigate that risk.
Okay, Mike.
Just on the previous point, you talked about doing the risk maturity again. If I just add in, because I didn't catch your eye, if we get some really clear benchmarks when that's done, it's interesting to know between naive and whatever the second one is, but actually, how does that compare to a council at this time? So just to ask that, if that could be in the minutes for future recommendation. In supposed to risk appetite, and I was going to kind of take you through something. I want you to think about the word emergency and what that would mean to your view of risk if you were in a genuine emergency. And as council has declared a climate emergency, but we consider our risk appetite in respect of green and local to be moderate to high. Now that doesn't seem to align the political will and the political claim of a climate emergency, probably the biggest risk in my view, that impacts on the residents of Newham going forward. It impacts on health, it impacts on community, it impacts on wealth, it impacts on the environment. And actually we have a view of our risk attitude being moderate to high, which isn't even just, we haven't even kind of pinned our colours to the mast and even chosen high. We've kind of gone, oh, there go the lights.
We have to move.
In terms of we've gone from moderate to high instead. So I guess my question was, how do you make sure that the risk appetite truly reflects the political ambition of the council, as well as, I guess, the wider appetite of the organisation? Because I see some misalignment there, particularly around climate. The lights back on now.
So you're right, it's moderate to high because we have very ambitious targets. The next category would be risk hungry. And for me, the risk hungry category, the red category, is really that we're pioneers, that we take risks, that we want to be first, that we try unknowns. And I think as the decisions get made and get taken to the CMT and to council, that the discussions will be on about, well, what is our appetite for this? At the moment it's high, but how far are we willing to go? Are we willing to be pioneers? And I think at that point, it's a discussion around what our appetite really is. Are we prepared to be the first? Are we prepared? How creative are we prepared to be?
I think what you described there is what a response to an emergency is. And what I hear from the mayor is that she wants this council to be driving on innovation and being the first. and that kind of doesn't align with that being receptive of climate. And I think that's quite disappointing in some respects, that the council is not matching the political rhetoric with the kind of the governance and controls of the council to deliver on it.
Good point.
I think challenge noted on that, unless
Yes.
you wanted to.
That might stop the cyclists that are going on Twitter now, because I seem to be the beating point for cyclists on Twitter at the moment, because I dare to suggest one of them wears a helmet. So hopefully that's got my green credentials well. But this is a really important point that we need to have a look at, is how that aligns.
Yeah.
I think it's worth making the point though as well. I mean, one, all discussions on this are helpful. That's how you then, develop and improve these things. I think again though, it's important to stress, this doesn't mean that we are not ambitious to try and meet the climate emergency targets that we've set ourselves. I think there is sensibly a balance to be struck, isn't there, in just how much innovation one local authority in a sector where we are all dealing with the same issues would necessarily be, as well as some very significant cost issues associated with this. So, don't necessarily disagree with the point about suggesting that maybe that risk appetite could be pushed higher. I do think it is important to stress though that what's in there, for a large public authority, and local authorities typically would be relatively risk averse. That is already expressing an attitude that we will take risks in order to try and meet the very challenging 2030 target. So I just think we need to be mindful of that. But I hear the point about whether that could be pushed a little bit further. But I think I don't think there's a sort of vast disconnect between what's been expressed there and what the council's political aspirations and objectives have been set out as being.
Okay, I just see. Let's take the final question on this from Daniel, if that's all right.
Hi, I'm not sure how much of a question it is, but just to say, and it relates to the conversation just been had, I welcome the part 9, page 40, the next steps, which in 9.2 talks about once the audit committee has approved. I think probably helpful, it was mentioned earlier, but just to re-emphasise for the public record that I think there are going to be some more discussions about risk appetite outside of the formal meeting process, where I think it might be helpful to explore some of the points that are being raised. I've got my own mind going in a certain direction, which relates to the climate emergency as one example, which the chair is aware of through emails earlier. But rather than drag this out today, I think just saying for the public record that as members, we want to, we're interested in this very much, and we want to explore this more. And in that context, just welcoming the next steps. And this is not the end of the conversation. Thanks.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. And the request is that the audit committee approve the approach, because I'm very mindful that if I produce a paper that everyone agrees with first time, well, it wouldn't happen. The whole point is to have discussion and challenge, exactly as you have done, saying, I think our appetite for this should be bigger or smaller or larger or changing. So it's not necessarily the detail in it, it's the approach. And you're absolutely right, the conversation will continue. And that's what risk management is about. We all have different approaches, different ideas to risk management, and it will evolve, they will change. And that's the whole purpose. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I think we're content to agree the approach. And then when we see the risk register each time, we'll bake in the appetite as part of that. Today's been a bit artificially siloed, but very much look forward to sort of that next iteration. Thank you. So we're on to the next substantive item, which is...
Sorry, Chair, do we have to show hands or anything? Is it just a no?
Okay, well, we'll show hands to say whether or not those risk approach statements are agreed.
Sorry.
Thank you. Right. So we'll move on now to substantive item 7, which is on highways. Just before we begin, I think it was, of course, a disappointing report, and it was cross-cutting across a number of areas. I felt as though it was almost as I think has been alluded to earlier, not drawing on some of the lessons we've learned from RMS. And I just wanted to highlight that it was disappointing to see. And I think we're going to play quite a keen interest in monitoring progress in relation to this going forward. So we'll have to sort of keep discussion fairly tight, but I certainly would just point out to members, I don't see this as the sort of final chance to discuss this. But I'm perhaps handing over to Nicola first to talk about the audit approach, or is it perhaps straight over to officers who might wish to respond?
I'm happy to do a brief introduction, Chair. So we started this audit in Q1. Originally, we were going to be looking at processes and procedures, but then an overspend was identified and an officer group has been set up to look at those. So rather than examine them in duplicate, we decided to try and find out the underlying reasons why the overspend happened. And that's the audit report is the result of that. This morning, you would have received an update from officers on the progress being made. I'd also like to say that we'll be revisiting this area probably in Q1 of next year to confirm that the procedures put in place are embedded. I'll hand back to the Chair now.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to hand over to officers just for a couple of minutes in terms of how you've received the report and an update on recommendations.
Thank you, Chair. So my name is Jamie Blake. I'm the Corporate Director for Environment and Sustainable Transport. So all of the highways section sits under myself. I've got, I think Jamie Cook is joining us, who's the Director of the service, and Paul Gannon has also joined us, who's ultimately if you like, the frontline manager who manages some of these services. So yes, limited assurance report is never a good thing to receive. I'm incredibly grateful to audit colleagues for being flexible in their programme and working with us to look at this particular issue. I think it has flagged up a number of underlying problems with the way that work is managed. It's quite a complicated workflow of repair and maintenance function across the highway service. It's not just about potholes. The service actually looks at all repair and maintenance on the highway, so it includes street lighting functions, the footways and any of the street furniture, especially stuff that sometimes gets damaged through road traffic accidents. So there's a range of functions that are managed from the highway service, and instructions are given to RMS, and RMS for the repair and maintenance part of the function are effectively our service deliverer. Very different from the planned maintenance programme and capital programmes, which are delivered through a third-party contractor. And I'll pick up maybe on the question that was raised early on about silos and issues around the repair and maintenance and planned maintenance later on in the discussion. So, as I said, limited assurance reports are never particularly well received, but they do happen. We had already started a programme of controls and improvements with a task and finish group with a range of members from across the organisation. My teams, RMS, finance and insurance. And we've already made some improvements within the service. We have absolute cost control now, and I can give absolute assurance that we are within budget at this particular point in time. There are other works that need to happen, especially around our inspections function and getting some of those processes up to speed. But we have a good working relationship with RMS officers and with, as I say, other interested bodies across the organisation. And we are on track to deliver all of the recommendations within the audit report. And we'd be more than happy to come back at a future stage to show the improvements that have been made.
Thank you. Can I open it up? Members' questions. Let's go first. John.
Thank you, Chair. Just got a brief question for Jamie regarding the range of work that RMS undertakes on the highways, has that actually widened, been expanded in the last year or two? Because I do remember hearing about a couple of years ago that it was the work RMS undertook was largely concerned with the potholes and the lighting. Now, you've told us it's more than that. I just wondered if that had actually been programmed to expand.
No, and I think that's one of the problems that comes out when you start talking about repair and maintenance. So the repair and maintenance of the highway, as I've said, has always been, as far as I'm aware, those other functions as well. So it's things like wobbly paving slabs, holes and damage that happens to footway, especially when you've got large vehicles. There's a lot of building going on across the bar at the moment, so there is damage happens to the footway as well, and there is a significant amount of cost associated with accidents that happen on the highway. Keep left signs especially get knocked down a lot. We always try and track those back to accidents, and we make claims from the relative insurance companies, but it's not always possible to track where the damage comes from. But RMS have always been responsible for the reactive maintenance of the highway. The planned maintenance, that's the resurfacing programme, the capital works, Section 106 works and such like, they are delivered through a third-party contractor. The procurement process for that contract was approved by Cabinet last week.
Okay, thank you.
Mike next.
Hi, Jamie. Thanks for joining us today. Either you or one of your colleagues has answered a lot of my questions, so you sent them to you in advance. So it'd be fair to give you a chance to pick up on those points I raised earlier. So I raised a concern over asking the control of the RIS contract. Obviously, was a significant scandal for you in previous years. Perhaps you want to come back on how those learnings are built into the relationship that your department has with RMS, particularly in terms of control of cost. So if you want to come back on that first, and then have a chat about how, some of the issues. The second question I'll ask and come back to in a minute will be how the issues raised here, access to the right tools to be able to approve budgets, training and competency of staff. If audit went into other areas of your department, would they find a similar trend? Because I suppose that's where my question on North British Corridor comes from. Is this an isolated issue to reactive maintenance or reactive repairs, or is that actually would we find the same problem across your whole department? So I don't know if you want to get back to those 2 points.
Thank you. So on the cost control issue, so if I could bring Jamie in on that one, and maybe Paul as well. So Jamie and Paul, when you first come in, can you explain your function and what you've got responsibility for? And Jamie, if you concentrate on the cost controls measures that we've got in now, which is about the assurance that we've got now, and I'll pick up maybe on some of the history and the changes that we've made to the management structure after you've spoken.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jamie. I'm Jamie Cook. I am the Director of Highways, Transport and Parking. So I've got responsibility for all of those services within the authority, and I commenced in my role in February this year. So in terms of the cost control, we've got a very strict process now. We meet with RMS every Thursday morning to review the expenditure and work performed during the preceding week. We've got a very firm agreement that we do not exceed the profiled expenditure for the month. Now, some months will be higher than others because we've got seasonal variation. So, for example, this time of year, we generally spend a bit less on defects. When we get to the colder months, autumn and winter time, we spend a bit more because we get more defects on the network. So we profiled it in that manner. RMS know very firmly that they cannot spend more than that amount without written permission from myself. And since April, we have been managing to budget. Occasionally, RMS will go out to a defect and it will require more work and more expenditure because it may well have deteriorated since it was first identified by one of our inspectors. If that means we will incur additional expenditure, RMS will need permission from either myself or Paul to perform that additional work.
And Jamie, how do you QA those additional expenditure items?
Paul, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I can do, Jamie. Thank you. Paul Gannon here. I'm the service manager for engineering. So the reactive maintenance falls under my remit. With regards to how we QA it, as part of the service, there's a general 10% check across all the work that's done by RMS, by our officers. We also go out with regards to any additional work that they have to do. As Jamie said earlier on, they contact us, we approve it and we check it and sign it off. Generally, one of the things we expect and we've allowed for within our budget is a variation of about 20% from the works that we go out when the guys, inspectors go out and do an assessment, they pick it up and they say it's a square meter, we say. We'll allow within that risk allowance a 20% increase. So that kind of covers us across the year and the pieces of work that we have from them. If they do pick up that piece of work and they go out and they find out it's larger than that 20%, as Jamie said, they come back and they ask for approval on that.
And Paul, you, just in terms of your experience in working in other organisations, is that a fairly standard process around the 20%, or is that a figure that's specific to RMS?
It's a fairly straightforward number that's used across the board, but in all fairness, it's something we've noticed as well in the last, probably the last year since I've started. We've spoke to RMS, and that was one of the things they said. The variations vary anywhere between 10 and 20%, and that's what we're using as a basis as part of maintaining that budget and controlling that budget going forward.
And in your 10% checks, then, have you noticed each? Careful how I frame this. In 10% checks, are you noticing that they are generally within budget specification? You haven't got a lot of extra 20% on top of everything. Is performance okay?
Generally, it is actually. It's improving. Our relationship with RMS is actually improving. They're an internal part of the organisation, so we have to work with them in partnership. It's an open book policy. We can go in and audit everything. We're actually working with them at the moment to try and reduce some of their costs and looking at how they procure some of their suppliers. And that's one of the things that we're working as the engineering side of it and not the labour side of it, to try and help them and manage that and improve that process so we can bring the cost down as well.
And I think it's worth also mentioning that it's not just the cost, but it's also the quality of the work.
Yeah.
So there will be some potholes, and this is a common thing across all contracts, where you have to do something really quickly just to make it safe. It's not pretty. It certainly won't last very long. But some of the sort of the 12 to 24-hour responses where RMS go out and literally stamp tarmac into a hole is made to last for 5 or 6 days before we can then organise something that is far more permanent. But they only get paid once for the job. So that, you know, if they take a choice that they're just going to do a quick fix, they then have to come back and do the permanent fix to make sure it's something that lasts for a reasonable period of time.
Winston.
If you're okay with that, do you want me to pick up on the other question around the sort of the general organisation, and do we think this is a wider problem across the highway service?
That's okay. Yeah, let's do that. And just before we go to Winston, sorry, let's do that. And just culturally, the ways you work in the context of the RMS scandal and how your department's culture might be responding to the findings of this report would be useful to touch on as well.
Okay, so I'm happy to pick that up, and Jamie and Paul might well come in as well. So I think it would be fair to say that the highway service has got some areas of really good practice within it. And I think one of the areas that Paul manages around the planned maintenance does really, really well. So we've got, this year, we've got about £17 million worth of capital works planned to be carried out. That includes the planned resurfacing, Section 106 works, the stuff with the Royal Docks. We've got a good track record in that particular area. We've got a good track record of cost control. We work very closely, as I've mentioned, with a third party contractor. We've got access to other specialist services through a call-off contract, and those contracts were actually renewed and approved by Cabinet last week. So I think that's an area that has worked well over the past 2 or 3 years. It's got really well managed processes and project management processes. And I think that's an example of where we want to be across the whole service. When you look at other aspects that we've introduced recently around low traffic neighbourhoods, healthy school streets, I think we're still on a learning curve with some of that. I think we're better than the ones that we originally put in. And I'm not talking about whether you agree with the policy direction around those particular aspects. This is about the implementation, and we're still learning. And certainly the healthy school streets projects that we're delivering now, I think have come on significantly from they were sort of 12, 18 months ago. I think there are issues that we have highlighted here within the repair and maintenance service and the relationship with other parts of the council, most notably with RMS in this particular instance, and the management and organisation of the highway service as a whole is going through a significant transformation. So Jamie's post is a new post. I started here in November 19. I brought in a new structure that had a director post sitting across highways, sustainable transport and parking. And that's now starting to, I think, bite in. And we had a temporary person in post there, and Jamie's now the permanent appointment. We've had a significant restructure within the highway service. My view is there was far too many agency staff. Some of those agency staff were really good, and I won't embarrass Paul by saying that certainly he was one of the shining lights of the agency staff, and we were really glad when he applied and was successful with the role. There are other agency staff that have now left the organisation, and we are going through a recruitment process. I think some of the answers to the questions that have been quite widely raised around the timing of the recruitment process and the scarcity of some of these resources are really important, but we have got some more people in post now. We are up to recruitment for some additional roles. We're looking at a graduate and apprentice scheme to try and grow our own. And certainly the lack of staff within these types of professional services around highways and transportation, it is a general problem across London, partly driven by the fact that we have TfL as a sort of a regional organisation that sucks a lot of the resources. To a certain extent, we're all fishing in the same pond for some of these technical resources. So there have been problems. There are still issues that we need to resolve, but I think the service as a whole is getting better. And I think the reputation that we've got in certain areas of Jamie and Paul's organisation is growing and is really showing signs of significant improvement.
Thank you.
Jamie, coming new into the organisation, you've only been here, what, 3-4 months now. I don't know if you've got any initial views that would help the committee in maybe shaping some of their future thoughts.
Yeah, so I think, as you say, Jamie, we've got some areas that perform very well and others, such as reactive maintenance, where I think we've got quite a way to go on our improvement journey. As part of our commitment to that improvement, we've recently become members of the Future Highways Research Club, which is a large highways sector benchmarking club run by Cranfield University's Business School. That comprises of 30 other highways authorities who share information and conduct value for money and service quality reviews. We've got our first review next Wednesday, which is an all-day workshop with involving our elected members as well. And we will have 2 peer reviews coming in, 2 other highway authority directors and an environment director to come in and challenge us on what we need to do across a range of service issues, from efficiency, service quality, our stakeholder management and lots of other things like that. So we will be able to share that report That will make us more aware of our as-is position and as benchmarked against other authorities, and we'll prioritise the actions we need to take to improve our service and provide us with some key performance indicators to enable us to know when we've made those necessary improvements.
Thank you. Can I go to Winston and then Neil?
I'm unsure if Jamie covered the point that I want to put in your representation just now. But one of the key elements of this report states that highways reactive repairs currently have up to 8 vacant posts. And it stated that vacancies resulted in performance of the highways. And there's an agreement here that management will recognize the importance of recruiting a full vacant post in that department and to be implemented by September 2021. How are you doing with that?
Jamie, do you want to pick up on that, on the where we are with the recruitment?
Yeah, sure, I'll do that. So we had 7 vacancies, 4 of which we have recently filled. So we have just appointed 3 highways inspectors and an insurance officer to the service. They will commence employment by September, so we're very pleased with that. They were very important roles for us to fill. We have additional vacancies, another 3 vacancies currently being advertised, 1 for a senior street lighting engineer and 2 vacancies for 2 senior highway engineer posts. I think the other thing that I would like to mention is that it was quite rightly picked up as part of your questions that we perhaps don't have quite enough of our staff with professional membership and accreditation at the moment, and that's an action that we've sought to take forward, and we have just signed up to the Chartered Institute of Highway and Transportation's Partnership Organisation Scheme, which will enable us to offer our officers a route to chartership, and that will enable us to benefit from wider industry thinking.
Good. Yeah, Winston. Sorry, not Winston. Neil, the next.
Yeah, it's been partly answered, I think, by Jamie Cook in relation to recommendation 7. I had to Google, by the way, during the meeting what this club was. But, you know, it'd be helpful if we had a bit more detail sometimes on what a club is. It seems to me it's a cross-borough partnership or a cross-local authority partnership. I was shocked with just 1 key KPI, the response we've got is going to be 2. Now we've got response that you're going to be formulating new those things, key performance indicators, in support of our overall council objectives. That was the answer that we've received. I want to know how we're going to monitor that, Chair, really, because it seems to me, you know, this is a very forward-facing service, something that, you know, my constituents and everybody else on this call, just living here, gets daily. And it's not just about the quality of street light or the, you know, response to our emergency repairs. That whole suite of indicators, I think, you know, that should be part of our next review process. So it's just an observation. I don't know whether Jamie can respond to that from the directorate level.
And I do apologise for employing another Jamie. There's far too many of them.
Yeah, exactly.
my DMTs get really, really complicated. Jamie, do you want to pick that up, because you've done work with the Future Highways Research Club before and around the KPIs?
Yeah, so at the moment we've got 2 KPIs related to works that RMS perform that we report at a service level. They are response to street lighting outages, so that's lights out of light, and RMS's response time to 2-hour emergency defect work. So we've got those 2, but as you say, that's not enough for a high profile safety related service such as this. So through our membership of the Future Highways Research Club, we will be able to benefit from looking at other highways authorities' KPIs. I'm already in possession of some of those. It's quite interesting to see the way that other authorities measure their services, and we will be able to have those challenged by those industry experts, and importantly be able to link them back to Newham's corporate plan and the desired corporate outcomes that we've got. Although it's not related to the reactive maintenance service, one of the KPIs for the overall highway service that we're going to be taking forward, which will be reported at a corporate level, is our killed and seriously injured figures, which we felt was important in the context of the corporate plan. So we will be taking a similar approach to the reactive maintenance KPIs.
And if I could just come in on the back of that, Chair, if I make clearly that there's, I mean, teaching you to suck eggs, but there's a whole range of service indicators that we will look at. The ones that rise to the top, if you like, for members to see, this committee and other performance committees, are the key performance indicators, and it's getting those right to make sure that members can give a view about whether the services are running in the right direction, and that we've got our benchmarking right as far as the challenge that we set ourselves around performance within the service.
We extend standing orders.
Well, no, it's just that for the meeting to be quorum, I need 3 elected members in the room and 1's left. So can we just wait for him to come back?
I think he's just gone for a company.
Need to wait a couple of minutes, perhaps.
Yeah, so
Okay.
for it at the moment. So
okay.
Right.
Sorry.
Thanks for pointing.
Oh, sorry, for those of you, just first, you've just got a brief hold. Just got to have 3 physically attending elected members in the room rather than the council building. So we have to pause.
It's a very technical way of saying it.
Can't extend standing orders as well, so the ending of mine.
What happens, yeah.
It's the time to.
That's quite clever of Winston there.
Probably still got this though. Yeah, I was going to do it. We are into the sorry down there. You know when you're conscious, one thing you can guess. He's back.
Here he is.
We have to wait.
Saving the day.
Because we're
about to suspend the meeting.
We had to suspend the meeting.
Sorry? We need 3 members to be quorum.
Are you voting? Right. No one going anywhere. We've already been out. We've both been out for the break. Yes. Do we need to extend a standing order?
Right, so before we recommence, I've got to extend the standing orders. Otherwise it ends at 9 o'clock. I think we can probably wrap up pretty quickly, but do members agree to extend the meeting by 30 minutes to 9:30 in accordance with standing orders? And only those physically attending elected members can vote. Yeah, that's carried, so we can keep going.
You go.
Let's kick back. Let's jump back into it. So I think almost probably might be the last question for today from Daniel. I think he's got his virtual hand up.
Thanks. And just to say I was pleased with some of the references to key performance indicators coming along. In the context, I was a little bit depressed, and it's not really a criticism, but it was still, I was depressed by the tone in finding 9, which I totally appreciate what it's about. But I was hoping for some acknowledgement about it's not just the risk of insurance claims per se, but it's what that represents in terms of the effects on the public, and in particular as an elected member representing everyone, not just those that have the insight and position to make claims. What that represents about all those people who don't make claims, who are, inhibited and marginalised by our failures in this area. And I appreciate that the item is on one specific point, but I just want that kind of in the ether, and that goes beyond just those killed and seriously injured. It's about people who don't feel that they're safe walking down the street anymore, and therefore feeling more isolated and so on. So it's no one needs to respond to it, but I just want that aired. Thanks.
Thank you. So I don't see any more questions. I think we'll wrap up for today, but as I sort of said at the beginning, we're keen to track and monitor progress towards these. I think we'll see you again. I think Nicole also referenced that there'd be a follow-up audit early next year. Work out when it's to come back.
Just a quick thing. I know it's a question which might not be related as such, but I did have a question which I'll put in the chat, but obviously it's told the chat's not
sorry,
available.
we can't see the chat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
My question was, apologies for not having the report in front of me, but the repairs that are carried out by the highways where cars are parked across on the pavement without any fear of enforcement, and cars crossing where there's no crossovers. Yeah. I'm just saying, how much of a dent is that happening along on the budgets, and also how is it actually picked up as a key thing, which is spreading more and more in the borough as we go along?
So I think tonight we've already had a range of known unknowns or unknown knowns and those things. So that's another one, Councillor. I'm picking my words carefully at the moment. So there is a lack of strategy and policy in this area, and that is something that needs to be addressed. Jamie and the team are looking at how to commission a transport policy for the borough that covers a whole range of issues around sustainable transport. We've touched on climate emergency tonight, and clearly the services that we run have a big impact on that. But there are some basic building blocks around policies such as crossovers, links to planning with crossovers, drop curbs, access, materials that are used on the highway, and we have not got, in my view, a firm enough policy footing to be able to change what has been a historic enforcement approach. We intend to go to Cabinet in the future with a transport policy that will fill all those gaps, that will give Cabinet and members suitable opportunity to feed into the policies and strategies that we have in this area, and then we will go out and do the enforcement on the back of that work. So yes, it is a gap. It's quite a significant gap. I have got no doubt it is causing a backlog of costs, but I think it would be unfair to residents and to my staff to all of a sudden change tack without having a clear future direction, set of policies for us to implement.
Chair, could I just come back? Jamie, I understand where we're going, but do you think there could be a timescale put to this, rather than just saying, yes, we're going to put a report together or a policy together, but for the comfort of myself and maybe a lot of other members, I, for one, picked up a planning application which showed a photograph of cars going across the pavement. So that doesn't look good on us when we are presenting this to other bodies as well. So a timescale in the future, maybe in the October report or something.
Okay. What I'll do is I won't put Jamie or Paul on the spot with this, councillor. We'll write to Audit Committee early part of next week once we've looked at the project plans, because we've got a project plan about how this fits through, and we'll give you an idea about when that is expected to go to Cabinet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie, to the two Jamies and Paul. Look forward to seeing them on that one. So we move on to the counter fraud report next. Just have a look on screen. I might be handing over to you for that. Oh, it's Nick. Nick's joined us. Thank you. Can I hand over to yourself?
Thank you, Chair. Taking the report as read, I just really wanted to highlight a few almost good news stories from previous subjects before inviting questions on the report. And that's largely that our trainee fraud investigator has recently passed her accreditation, which is good news for us. And also that individual was kind of an internal recruit that has obviously come to us, and that we're kind of upskilling to work within our teams. I think that's quite good news. Equally, in relation to our growth, we've also got a new fraud investigator joining the team next month, which will help with resources, and as well as kind of going back to some form of visits, and also now trying to do or being able to do interviews because of what's happened in the pandemic. We also got our first criminal conviction a few weeks ago, whereby the individual pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud, with sentencing later in the year. So once sentencing takes place, we will be able to kind of do a full release on that and share further details. But I just thought I'd add those little sort of snippets, and happy to take questions on the report that was submitted.
Thank you. We'll go in the order that I sort of saw and pop up. So first Neil, then Winston, then John.
Yeah, very briefly, because we're running out of time. On 4.2, we stopped 23 applications. This is in terms of COVID discretionary business grants. There's been some national issues with this, clearly. So, that it's not about banging. I would have thought that 115,000 in prevented payments was on the lower end compared with what I've been reading, but that may have been press scaremongering or other sort of, shall we say, exaggerations. And then, if that's okay, Chair, because they're not quite related, but just while I'm speaking, when you look on paragraph 5.1, you've said the total amount spent by the authority on investigation and prosecution is only included and excludes legal costs. Do we have a figure yet for legal costs, either coming in or out? Because, obviously when we win. When London Borough of Newham wins a case, presumably the opponents pay costs. But do we have any legal costs to this report?
Okay, so just to address those 2 points, the first one in relation to the figures, that figure will be higher now. So at the next kind of report, that will be updated and includes, so the figure will be more than the initial 23 that was presented there. In relation to the second point, obviously that particular information is relating to what we have to supply under the Transparency Code, and it's pretty much just the staff costs, so don't include any other of the kind of income that we get in. The legal costs I don't have available in front of me now, but I can then get them, but obviously that wouldn't give the 100% picture because it wouldn't include the savings or any money that we've kind of gone in as well. That the figure that's presented there is purely just pretty much the team in relation to salary, opposed to any other income or expenditure.
On a more general point, can I just, while I'm on legal costs, because we did have a history in this council of, having sort of disguised costs. Ones were sort of planning costs and planners 5% or 10% when they were doing major profit. Another one was always legal costs, and I don't know quite where it goes in terms of reporting. I get your answer that that's the Transparency Code.
Yeah.
So I'm not putting you on the spot. Perhaps it might be Conrad who needs to answer this one about legal costs and generally.
So, sorry, can I just be clear exactly what the question is?
How do we identify legal costs as something that's coming in or out? Do you see
yeah, I mean, once cases get to the point, that a lawyer's actually opened a file on it, for example, they've been instructed, then at that point, all of those costs are identified through our legal department's time recording system, which they operate for a bunch of reasons, one of which is absolutely so that you can identify costs at this point. Of course, identifying costs is one step in the process. You then need to win your case. You then need to actually have costs awarded, which may or may not happen depending on the nature of the judgment that you get. And then, of course, you've got to enforce it. sometimes that can all happen relatively easily, but more often than not, it's not the case, and one can have a cost order that may be prohibitively expensive to enforce. So I mean, it's not to say there's anything wrong in the council's arrangements for that. That's just the nature of the legal process, really. But we do, at the point at which a lawyer is instructed, whether internally or indeed for very complex cases externally, we do identify all of the costs being incurred. The legal costs being incurred, I should say. We don't have a sort of wider timesheet system for everyone else's time that goes into these cases, which can involve a great number of people. But courts will, as a rule, only contemplate costs for legal fees like that.
And maybe just to add on to that as well, with a lot of our cases that do go the full way and are heard in court, there is also a considerable amount of time between perhaps when some of those costs would be incurred to actually the end of the case. So you could realistically have a situation where certain costs are either received or we have to pay out that spread for one case over sort of two different financial periods as well. So it's not always as straightforward as what have you spent this year, because those costs could be spread.
Thank you. Can go to Winston and then John.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question was going to be on costs, actually, and I think you just had a debate on that. But looking at paragraph 2.2, which refers to additional 306,000 national savings, does that mean that central government get a portion of that?
I think that's notional.
Sorry?
No, not national, notional.
Notional.
Oh, notional savings. Okay. Which have an effect on national government funding, is it?
No, the notional savings are what our kind of, if it wasn't for detecting our fraud, what we would have perhaps have had to have paid out as the council. That's how they're calculated. So the figures above that figure would have been added to it for the year.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks.
Well, just before I turn to John, I was just looking at actually the amount spent on the authority by investigation of fraud, 426k, and then you've got all of your sort of housing fraud, 150, additional 350, 300. So that's 450 there. Do you think about it on a return on investment basis to say, if you were to, this is a bit of a basic illustration, invest another 3 FTE in your fraud team, you'd get this ROI, and therefore that would be a net value add to the council. You do sort of that challenge every quarter, annual basis on the size of the team.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things is that there's obviously no guarantee that more people will mean more cases, because we could get the way it works, we could get one case in a month, we could get 5 cases that are results in a month, and I think overall I'd probably say yes, the more the more people we have, but I don't think it's as straightforward as looking at it in terms of, well, if you double you'll get double.
Yes.
But I think from what the team in the last sort of 9 months really has seen some progression and stability in relation to the team expanding, new people coming in. So I think that will kind of end up reflecting. Equally, the number of prosecutions that we've had up until this point, or in the last kind of 2 to 3 years, has been pretty minimal. So therefore, we should start to see those come to fruition as well. So I think the short answer is yes, it would make some difference, but it's not as simple as doubling numbers to double the savings.
It's more about how you build that challenge into your I guess your business planning process for in terms of the size of your team, that you've got that challenge.
Yeah, and it also depends on volume coming in as well. So there's a kind of standard recognised number of average number of cases that an investigator may hold at one time, and so we would look at that in terms of the volume coming in to what each investigator's got to be able to know, well, if each investigator had an additional, double the amount of cases than would usually be expected, then then perhaps more resource would get more results. But if the volumes are lower, then additional resource wouldn't necessarily help.
Okay, thank you. Is that a legacy hand, Conrad, or is it?
No, it was just to add to what Nick's saying there, and well done, Nick, for advocating for more staff. And of course, we do absolutely look at that sort of return on investment as it's put. I suppose 2 points to make. One, forward work, although there is or can be a financial return, is not done wholly for that purpose. The other to emphasise is at this table that we're looking at, although it follows a nationally recognised methodology, savings are notional or quite hard to sort of capture in an individual budget. You can absolutely see the cost of the individual investigator, and they will, I'm sure, do lots of very good work and identify more cases and so on. But the savings, it's not really that that's why they're described as notional. You can't sort of remove that money from another budget to pay for the investigator, because what you've done very narrowly from the council's point of view is remove one unlawful paying tenant with a lawful paying tenant, and that's really good that we've brought social housing back into use. That doesn't feed through into the council's bottom line. So I just think we need to be slightly careful. The principle of what you're saying in terms of return on investment is important. We do just need to remind ourselves that the financial benefits to the council's bottom line are notional, but the costs are real.
That's really clear. Thank you. And John, sorry, went first.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. My questions are on page 80, and the first one is related to corporate fraud, 1.3, where it says, where we have sufficient evidence of a criminal offence being committed, and when it's in the public interest to do so, we will consider criminal prosecution for any staff member found to have committed fraud. So after reading that, I wondered in what sort of case would not give rise to pursuing a criminal prosecution? That's my first question. And the other two questions are related to the table, fraud team housing performance. With the properties recovered, I wondered how the notional savings were calculated. And the other question is, it refers to the removal from the housing list. In 2020-21, we can see a very big increase in the rise of those people removed. I just wondered whether this reflected a change in approach.
Okay, so just starting at the first question. I mean, each case is going to be on a case-by-case basis in terms of why we would look to, when we talk about the public interest test. I mean, one of the things we may look at or may consider could be the value of the fraud. So, for example, if someone was found to have stolen something belonging to the council of say a value of £20, it would still be a crime, and obviously various disciplinary process would take place. However, in liaison with the legal team, it may be considered that would it be in the public interest to pursue that criminally given the value of it. So that's a sort of very basic example and the things that we would consider. But as I said, it's very difficult to answer that because each case will be very, very different. But I would kind of caveat that by saying that we don't kind of almost take the eye that, okay, we just won't try to prosecute. So we're not talking about lots of cases here and we're like, okay, we won't do that one. It's not that kind of thing, but we've put that there just to cover the fact that, each case will have some form of variance in circumstance. Does that help with the first one?
It helps, but you've said really it's just on a case-by-case basis, and there's not necessarily clear guidelines, in fact?
We've got some internal documents that look at that a bit further, which I could circulate and share. But even with that, I would say that because the cases we get are so different, even if you look at unlawful subletting cases, the variant of them and the different components are so different that it's very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all for any of the work we do, because nearly no two cases will be the same with a certain element of that. But as I said, we will always try to make the best decision for the council as to how we proceed.
Okay. Do you mind if we move on? I'm just keen to keep some time.
I did have a couple of other questions, which I think are going to be quite quick, answered very quickly, which I've asked them, in fact.
Yeah, do you want me? Yeah, so in relation to the numbers, the sort of 18,000 that's used to calculate that is a generic figure that's used across the sector. We are exploring whether or not we can get an actual figure for the cases we do, and when we go to court, if we're able to, so if we're looking at trying to recover any funds in compensation or through proceeds of crime, we will look to see if we can determine what the actual figure is. But for the purpose of this form of reporting, that sort of national figure that we use is a generic one that is used by many councils across the UK. In relation to your other point in terms of the housing list, there's been a slight change in focus, but one of the main reasons that was that during obviously 2021, whereby our officers couldn't go and do visits and couldn't do interviews, we did refocus to look at grants. We did a lot of the groundwork, and therefore we was also able to do a lot more in relation to the housing list. So it's more of a just refocusing our attention due to the pandemic.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much, Nick. We'll see you sort of the next quarterly update. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
That takes us on to sort of last substantive item, which is 10, and the update on the procurement audit findings. And we're actually joined in person by Rose in the back over there.
Oh, she's enough.
I don't know if you wanted to say a few things just to give a flavour of progress.
Thank you, Chair. I thought what I'd give you is a verbal update of what we've achieved since I last met you, and then if you want to ask any questions. So it's 3 months. 3 months have flown by, and I have to say, personally, I feel I've got a much better grip on where we're at with procurement. A lot has happened since I last visited you. We've launched a new intranet which gives very clear guidance on procurement and walks officers through a step-by-step process, and those pages have all got regular reminders of no PO, no pay. I've got some new non-public sector officers that we're training up, and they're developing step-by-step checklists, so we're trying to use them as training opportunities. They then roll that out across the rest of the team. So we're doing internal training. We've some of the fusion issues that we were experiencing with the quick quotes and the tender systems have dropped off completely. We've been running drop-in sessions jointly with accounts payable, and it's been very well attended and well received. We are launching next week. We're starting new bookable contract standing orders training for officers. And we've also been fully involved with training for new managers as part of their induction. So they're getting guidance on procurement. We're also developing online modules, videos and all that cool stuff that young kids do. So I'm leaving them to that. We've kicked off our new governance process, started today. We've launched a new gateway review group, so we're managing procurements through various gates to keep them on track, and also to be able to identify when things are going off track so we can put mitigation in place early. We have kicked off a piece of work on social value, which links into the new government guidance. So in speak from the audit report, it talks about non-price benefits. And so that's linked very heavily to the climate change agenda, net zero, supply diversity and new jobs and the local economy. The one kind of bit of bad news is that the contract register completion percentage has dropped. To be fair, when I got here, I was kind of bemused that we were reporting an 80% completion, which is far higher than the other 4 councils that I've worked at where I've done this. 80% normally takes about a year to 18 months to complete. And I did a bit of analysis and discovered that we've got some big capital contracts in the register, but not the capital spend. And so moving that spend in has shifted the percentage. But nevertheless, the progress is actually is quite good. And remembering actually that percentage is just a benchmark to measure against, and it will be fairly fluid. We are working hard on a culture change actually in the department. I think there's been a bit of, with lots of interims being in the department and being managed by an interim, I think there's been a slight drop in standards. We have now got a management system of procurements which actually tracks, so managers can work with their officers on one-to-ones and hold them to account. The gateway process is going to give officers, directors, budget holders and Section 151 some assurance that what we're doing is correct, technically correct, as well as supporting the council to deliver savings. We're reviewing the risk of every procurement right at the beginning, so we've completely changed the process management. And, you know, I'd like to say I've got fairly high standards. There's an awful lot to do. We're doing a lot, and we have made significant progress. I do want to kick off a piece of work on contract management, but I'm anxious to actually not overdo all the change and try and get some things bedded in before we move on to the next phase. Which for me will be benchmarking against other London boroughs in accordance with the new guidance coming from government. And I'll leave it there because otherwise I start to sound like I'm waffling.
Thank you, that's brilliant. Do you mind if I kick off?
Okay.
I think what you very helpfully call out in your report is almost a bit of a final hurdle, which is at 4.7, where you've got in the different directorates, maybe they've got procurement in the job title, the job spec, regardless of people across the organisation doing procurement. And what's you said that it's suggested that these individuals be transferred to SB. That seems pretty crucial, doesn't it, in terms of transforming culture, processes, and that's necessary centralisation. So is that suggested? Is it happening? What's the timeline? What's the plans to bring that into effect?
So of the 3 or 4 people I know about, 2 of them are interims. And so I'm anxious that I don't get the salary budget transferred, but the interim costs. So I think there's some conversations to have if we recruit to those posts. And what I'm doing in the meantime is subsuming those individuals into our management process. So the first phase is they're getting involved in the gateway process, they've been trained on the iProcure system, and their projects are going through the same compliance checks as the internal projects are. And then I'll have to have conversations with the directors who own those individuals to see what we do next. But for me, it's about the governance and control more than where those people sit necessarily.
Great, thank you. That's clear. Neil.
Yeah, thanks very much. And you highlighted what I was going to ask about 4.1, which is that the progress with the completion of the contract register has been slow. You did indicate that that was about capital spend. That capital spend figure, once you've sort of aggregated or disaggregated, as it were, you know, when do you think you will reach a higher level of that completion?
So it's an ongoing, so there's a few phases of work. The first phase is capture as many contracts as you can. What we're now doing is Fusion is now producing reports of high level spend. So what we're doing is matching that to contracts and then issuing the list that we cannot match out to directors to say, okay, here's the list of spend that would appear to not have a contract. You need to focus on these, and it helps them because now they know what they're looking for rather than just randomly trying to get all their contracts to me. We're now giving them specific information to look for.
And a related point, just very briefly, on 411, you rightly talk about the gateway system. I was just, where there's a contract award, mobilisation, handover to BAU?
Business as usual.
Oh, right.
So procurement run it, but then the service manage it. Sorry, I should have.
No, I just thought it was another unit you were setting up.
No.
I get SPU, I got that. And then just on that, that's not just a little cheeky thing about three-letter acronym, but if you're doing contract award, mobilisation, handover to business as usual, the recording of savings and social value, do we have the actual indicators on how you're measuring the social value?
Sorry,
what are the indicators of how you measure social value?
So,
interesting question. Yeah.
Because we've had this debate over the years.
Okay, so there's
We've got 5 minutes left.
I'm drafting a separate paper actually to go to CMT on this because there's about 180 different indicators that are listed on the social value portal. And the risk is if you deliver one of it or all of those 180 things, you don't actually make a difference. So my proposal in this paper is that we ask either Cabinet or the CMT to identify the top 3 things that are important for Newark so that we can multiply the scores and try and focus our suppliers on those 3 things. But there is a national priced menu, if you like, of social value deliverables, which we're proposing to use, but we want to focus scores to things that are more local, address local priorities.
It's a bit like the wellbeing index, it's a bit like the multiple deprivation. It's multivariate analysis, and you can end up, as you say, with 180.
Yeah, if you deliver one of everything, you don't really achieve very much.
Thanks. That's all.
Brilliant. Any more questions?
Quick one.
Yeah.
Where it states no PO, no pay, I take it that's purchase orders. Is that right?
Say that again, sorry.
No PO, no pay.
Yeah.
PO.
Purchase order.
Okay, thank you.
If there's no purchase order, the supply can't get paid.
Yes, of course.
And well, just whilst we're on that topic, it might be time for a final one. How do you track that? And presumably there's this broader goal of getting to close to 100 as possible.
How we track the no PO, no pay?
Yes, yeah, you've got the intranet page, you've got the training, the systems.
Yeah, so there's now a report that comes out of accounts payable, I think it comes from, where they identify where requests have been made for payment. And they can also identify now with the new Fusion system when the PO was raised after the invoice was received, that kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah, last one.
I guess it's just a statement just to close on is that my one concern with the no PO, no pay model is that it can be more difficult to access for small businesses, particularly new businesses. So they're smaller, local, newer businesses that are transacting with the council will probably find that more challenging. So we probably want to see an emphasis on training and support for local businesses to make sure, your large cleaning suppliers, etc., will find it quite useful to work in an ERP system. But for the smaller suppliers, we want to see smaller suppliers be engaged in community wealth building. We need to make sure that payment system is accessible to new businesses.
May I answer that one? So I used to run a small business, so this is one of my favourite topics. So wherever I go, I set up small business open evenings so that we invite them in, tell them how the tender system works, talk to them about evaluation and help them to register on the system. Because if they register on the system, they see our opportunities. So it's an end-to-end process. So that's one of my things.
Brilliant. I think that brings us about to time. Thank you. We'll skip over the year ahead forward plan unless there's any comments on that now. Otherwise, we'll say that the next meeting is quite a long way away, 30th of September. But over the summer, just to flag, Nicola and team are going to, I believe, do some interviews and so on with members as to establishing our own audit committee's effectiveness. So look out for that prior to the next meeting. Is anything else, I think we'll call the end of the meeting. Thank you very much to officers and members for the evening.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Wants to speak, Fiona?